Good afternoon and good evening to all our guests across Canada and beyond. Thanks for joining the Psychedelic Association of Canada's webinar on the war on drugs. I'm Gillian Maxwell. I'm a founding member of the Psychedelic Association Canada, which was born on December 31st, 2019. Seems like a century ago, but it was only a couple of years. We work to gain access to psychedelics and plant medicines for all Canadians. We work at many levels, engaging with policymakers and politicians, creating and bringing together communities across Canada. We have brought together several dynamic groups within the association so they can connect and chat, such as doctors and therapists, nurses, harm reduction workers, and businesses. Please join us, become a member, www.psychedelicassociation.net, so that we speak with a united voice to establish access to psychedelics throughout Canada. We are a lean machine operationally. We're a nonprofit organization that relies on grants and donations to keep the lights on, our 1.5 staff, and we have many outstanding volunteers, and thank you all. Although I'm not there right now, I'm usually based in Vancouver, British Columbia. I acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional shared unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. I'm so delighted to introduce you to our anti-prohibition panel today. They have been working tirelessly and effectively to advocate against the war on drugs for over 2 decades, way longer than that. And we are honored that they're joining us today. I'll just introduce both of them and then we will begin. Deborah Small is a lawyer and social justice activist fighting back against the inequities of the US government's so-called war on drugs. She is the executive director of Break the Chains in the US, an organization that aims to build the movement in communities of color in support of drug policy reform with the goal of replacing failed drug policies with alternatives based in science, compassion, public health, and human rights. She is also an advisor to the Psychedelic Association of Canada. Ethan Nadelmann, described by Rolling Stone as the point man for drug policy reform efforts and the real drug czar, Ethan Nadelmann is widely regarded as the outstanding proponent of drug policy reform, both in the United States and abroad. He founded and directed first the Linda Smith Center and then the Drug Policy Alliance from 1994 to 2017, during which time he and his colleagues were at the forefront of dozens of successful campaigns to legalize marijuana and advance other alternatives to the war on drugs. Ethan currently hosts the leading podcast on all things drug, Psychoactive. Check it out. It's very interesting. He talks to fascinating people. So we're going to cover, hopefully we're going to cover 4 areas: the origins of prohibition, the overdose death crisis, what works and what doesn't work in affecting change, and how does the rise of psychedelics impact prohibition across the board. I'm intending that we get to your questions, and a reminder that both our guests are lawyers who love to talk. The thing is, though, with Deborah and with Ethan, you're hanging on to their every word versus waiting for them to stop. So we'll see how it goes. So let me welcome you again, welcome everybody who is watching and participating. And I have to just see if there's anything I've missed down here. No, that's James talking to you all. Okay, great. So let's begin. Do you want to say any opening? Well, no, let's not say opening comments. Let's say, who would like to succinctly just tell us how the war on drugs started, how prohibition became about, and bring us sort of up to date with that? Because there are a lot of younger people in this community. I was at the Spirit Plant Medicine Conference in Vancouver 3 days ago, and you know, many people are certainly under 40, a lot under 30. And I don't think they're particularly, they're really very versed on what's happened before. And, you know, if you walk around Vancouver these days, there's not on every street, but there are a lot of places that sell psilocybin these days. And it just looks like that it's all legal, which of course it isn't. And I think it's really important for them to understand the context in which all of this is placed. So Which one of you would like to give us a succinct version of how we got here with Prohibition, how it started?
Deborah,
Ethan, why don't you go? No, you
I'll
go. I know you can do the elevator talk faster than me.
Okay, well, I mean, I guess, put it into some broader historical, there have been drug prohibitions throughout history. And of course, one of the more notorious ones was the US prohibition of alcohol, which was barely replicated in a few other countries at the time, but from 1919 to 1933. And it became a model for a movement that was driven oftentimes by optimistic public health, safe society goals, but landed up doing far more harm than good when it actually succeeded in establishing national alcohol prohibition. And people kind of woke up to it. And I think when we got going in the early stages of the drug policy reform movement in the late 1980s, it provided quite a model for us. When you look at drug prohibition in the country, it's important to realize that in the United States and many other parts of the world, late 19th century, most of the drugs that are currently or were until recently illegal were in fact legal. Morphine, opiates, et cetera, were legal. In 1898, Bayer Pharmaceuticals puts both pharmaceutical heroin and aspirin, and that's sold legally over the counter for a while. Heroin's a cough suppressant, quite effective at that, and for most people was a beneficial medicine, but turned out to be problematic in other ways that we fully can understand today. Cocaine were in popular patent medicines and things like that, and cannabis was not criminalized in most places. But then what happened was, in part, driven in good part because of racism and ethnocentrism, what we saw was the criminalization of these substances. Most opiate users in the late 19th century were middle-aged women, white women, and nobody thought about putting them behind bars for using their opioids. But when the opiates got associated with Chinese migrants, working on the railroads and the mines and going home to smoke a little opium, just as they did in the old country, that's when you saw the first opium prohibition laws in California and Nevada in the 1870s and 1880s. Cocaine, once again, widely legal, but when it got associated with Black men in the South, sorting this cocaine and the fear of what would these Black men do to the precious white women in the same way that people were worried what the Chinese would do in their opium dens to white women. That's where you saw the first cocaine prohibition laws. And the same thing with marijuana to some extent. I mean, it was about Mexican migrants and Mexican Americans in the West and the Southwest. The fear of what, of these people bringing these substances into the country, taking good jobs from good white people and all this. And that played a role together with other, discriminations against other types of perceived deviant populations. In fact, even the onset of alcohol prohibition was to some extent about a broader conflict between the white Americans and the not so white Americans. The white Americans who had come to the US in the late 18th, early 19th century, and the not so white Americans who came to the US in the late 19th, early 20th century from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe. So that dimension has always loomed large, both in the onset of prohibitions, not just the United States, played a role in Canada, the UK, Australia, and quite a few other places as well, but especially intensively in the United States. And of course, it also shaped how we proceeded with the war on drugs. That although, Nixon wanted to go after the hippies and all of this and the liberals, the other major element of his war on drugs, is his declaration of a war on drugs in 1970 or 71 that really kind of launched the first stage of the modern war on drugs. And that was about, it was an element, it was a part of a Republican agenda of playing on people's fears around race and crime and hippies and alternative, dissidents and Vietnam War protesters. And then things subsided in the late 70s, but in the 1980s, it really began to emerge once again. And very much, although Reagan was in the White House and then the first George Bush after that, it was very much of a bipartisan war on drugs that kicked into hypergear in 1986 or so, as crack cocaine became a notorious problem drug. And as cocaine shifted from being associated with more affluent white Americans, Wall Streeters, middle class, upper middle class, to poor Black and brown people. And that's when you saw the onset of really the beginnings of mass incarceration, driven overwhelmingly in the 80s, 90s, and aughts by the war on drugs. So that's, Julian, how I would kind of sum up that quick evolution of the war on drugs. And the way I've often described it, what happened in the late 80s and early 90s in ways that younger people don't realize, it was like McCarthyism on steroids. Hopefully your audience knows what McCarthyism was. That was the hysterical anti-communism of the 1950s that did not result in mass incarceration, but did result in the persecution and stigmatization and terrorizing of large numbers of Americans based upon overstated fears of communist infiltration into America.
Mm. Thank you, Ethan. Anything to add, Deborah?
So thank you, Ethan. I think that was a very good summary. I would only add 3 things that I think are important that are through threads, both to alcohol prohibition and drug prohibition, which Ethan touched on to some degree when he talked about cultural anxiety. But I think you can't discount the role of economic competition and the need to elevate certain groups of workers over others. So the first laws targeting the first laws against opium were really directed at as a way of criminalizing Chinese workers who were competing with white workers for jobs. The law, it was harder to just discriminate against people by virtue of their race, although that was not illegal at that time, but it was easier if you could justify doing it by calling them criminal. And so the laws against alcohol were designed to criminalize immigrants in urban areas who were considered to be competition for older groups of American settlers. One way of being able to reduce their competition was to criminalize them by making this substance that they used regularly, alcohol, illegal. Similarly, the drugs that were chosen to be made illicit were specifically made illicit because of their use by these populations of people who the majority population wanted to marginalize. So Chinese were not the only people who used opium, but they were the only ones who smoked it on a regular basis. So the first laws against opium were specifically against smoking opium and the spaces and places in which they did that. Later on, it began to include all forms of opiate use, but initially it was about specifically targeting smoking opium. Again, with alcohol prohibition, the first laws were called the anti-saloon laws because it was about targeting the places where immigrants hung out and the activities that they engaged in there, which was drinking alcohol. And each of these waves was accompanied by major efforts at educating the public to demonize these substances. So there was a major anti-alcohol education campaign that went on in the United States that supported alcohol prohibition. And similarly, as we began to prohibit illicit substances, first opium, then cocaine, then cannabis, there were major anti-drug education campaigns that were specifically designed to demonize these substances and the people who use them. But the second thing that I think is really important to remember about each of these areas of law is that I call it the bait and switch approach to policy making, in that in each case, the public was told that what was being made illegal initially was not the substance per se, but the manufacturers, that the laws were designed to go after predatory manufacturers who were making alcohol and ensnaring our people in drunkenness. We were going after the people who were manufacturing opiate and using it to ensnare our people. So the public was always sold that the target of the law was going to be predatory businesses that were going after consumers. And then after the law were passed, that it was changed so that the enforcement became focused on the consumers, not manufacturers. And I think that's an important thing to remember, because if prohibition worked, then you would have seen a significant reduction in drinking during alcohol prohibition. You would have seen a significant reduction in drug use during drug prohibition. But if what we've seen is just the opposite, each of these policies has not had any major impact on demand. But what they have done is generate criminal cartels, criminal networks of people who are now involved in this illicit trade. They've created black markets that didn't exist before, with all of the health harms and political corruption that goes along with it. And so to me, why I think that point is important is because every time we have a conversation about drugs, the public is always told the same thing. We're going after the dealers. We're going after the manufacturers. But then once the law is put in place, the people that they target are consumers, are small sellers, are little people who have no impact at all on the trade. And what we've done in over 50 years of the war on drugs, I mean, every few months we'll see some news story where they'll put tons of drugs on the table with tons of money and show us, look at how great we're doing. We seized all these drugs. We got all this money. And yet after 40 years of seeing this repeated over and over again, we know that drugs are as plentiful as they've ever been. They're cheaper than they've ever been, and they're more potent than they've ever been. And so I think it's important for those young people who don't understand the history to recognize the okie doke. If you don't remember anything else that we say, remember this: do not allow yourself to be baited and switched into supporting any more forms of prohibition, whether it's on drugs, alcohol, or sex.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Julia, I was just going to add one little sort of nuanced point to that. To some extent, we have to acknowledge that drug prohibition can, in fact, reduce the number of consumers, and drug wars can do that at times. So, for example, between 1916, 3 years before alcohol prohibition became a national amendment, and 1922, 3 years after it did, there was the most dramatic drop in alcohol consumption and alcohol problems ever in U.S. history. And that initially gave people reason to believe that prohibition could work. Now, in fact, what had happened was a whole bunch of things came together. There were all these temperance movements and people taking temperance oaths against consuming alcohol. There had been World War I in a spirit of wartime sacrifice, and grain needed to be used for the soldiers, not to be making booze at home. There was also anti-German sentiment, and German Americans were very deeply involved in the breweries. But then what happened in 1922 was it kind of bottomed out, and use started to go up at the same time that all of the criminal consequences of a prohibitionist policy began to go up. So by the time you got to 1933, levels of alcohol use were as high as they had been at the beginning of alcohol prohibition. But use had shifted from beer and wine much more towards hard liquor, because hard liquor was much more potent. Al Capone did not want to put liquid on his trucks that was 94% water and 6% alcohol. He wanted the more bang for the buck. He wanted to be shipping, stuff that was 100 proof, 150 proof, right? And similarly, to jump forward, in 1980, after the Carter era, when there had been a fairly liberal policy in a way for a few years on drug policy, the number of Americans using drugs illicitly was estimated at 40 million. Then we launched the war on drugs. By 1990, the number had dropped more or less in half to roughly 20 million, right? And so you saw drug warriors claiming great success. But in fact, what had really happened was that most of the people who had stopped using were people who never got a problem with drugs in the first place. And they were casual users of cannabis, mostly of sometimes cocaine. Meanwhile, from 1980 to 1990, what did increase, massively was the billions of dollars being spent by federal and state and local governments on the war on drugs. What did increase were the number of people struggling with, heroin addiction and crack cocaine. What did increase were the number of people being infected, drug users, with HIV/AIDS, because we were having draconian drug war policies. So it's important that when we're thinking about the ways we assess a drug policy, that focusing on the number of people who actually violate the law or the number of consumers is very much, it's almost an irrelevant statistic or a very minor statistic. Far more important is looking at the cumulative harms that stem from both drug use and the drug policies themselves. And with both alcohol prohibition and with the drug war, the modern drug war, what we saw that the harms of both drugs and the drug policies both grew dramatically with more intensive, more punitive policies.
Thank you. I'd like to move on, but not that far from where you just finished off, Ethan, into the overdose death crisis that is in Canada and North America and probably around the world. I don't know. I can't imagine not. And I'd like if to put that into context of prohibition, and if one of you could explain why there is a toxic supply as compared to 30 years ago, like what has gone on. I know it as a result of prohibition, and I would invite one of you to explain that for us.
I mean, I don't know that I would say that what we have now is an overdose death crisis. I think we have a massive poisoning crisis, which is slightly different.
Yes, it is.
You know, but
yes.
I think it's that, to me, that distinction is important. I lost my uncle to a heroin overdose in 1961 when I was six. That was a period where urban areas in New York were in the United States were experiencing higher levels of heroin use and heroin overdose deaths. What we're seeing today is not really that. It's more the result of the introduction of fentanyl into the drug supply. And many of the people who are dying, I would say, are dying of accidental poisoning. And to me, that's an important distinction in the sense that overdose, at least it sounds like something that people do to themselves. They take that's our general understanding of it, that you take too much of something and it has a toxic impact on you. But most of the people who are dying today are not aware of the amount of fentanyl that's in their drugs. So they are not consciously taking too much of something. They are being poisoned. And I'll liken it to actually a period during alcohol prohibition, which is another part of the history that's been buried, where the government actually allowed for batches of alcohol to be deliberately poisoned in ways that would cause significant harm to the people who were using it. I think you remember this period, Ethan. People were going blind and suffering from other things as a result of poisoned alcohol. And the people who were proponents of prohibition thought this was good because you were going to deter people from using illicit alcohol if they knew that these horrible things could happen to them. But one of the things that got many American women to turn away from temperance and to begin to lobby to get rid of prohibition was because of this deliberate willingness to allow people to die in an effort to somehow deter them away from drugs. Well, we're seeing, to me, this is where we are right now, in that we recognize and we know that the large numbers of people who are dying of fentanyl-related deaths today are preventable deaths. They could be prevented if we provided people a safe legal supply and if we gave them safe places to use. But we're not willing to do that. There are other countries like yours, like Switzerland, like Spain and others that have, in Australia, that have actually shown the health benefits of providing people with legal supplies of heroin and or safe spaces to use. And yet, and I'm here in the Bay Area, we've lost more people to drug-related deaths in the last few years than we've lost to COVID.
Yeah, exactly. It's the same in BC. It's the same in Canada.
And you would think that that would be met with the same emergency response that we harnessed to respond to COVID. And yet our governor, who is considered by most people in the US to be super progressive, just vetoed legislation that would have allowed California to establish safe consumption spaces, even though it's acknowledged by him and everyone else that we have a public health crisis with drug-related deaths. And I'll stop with that.
I just want to say, thank you, Deborah. I just want to say, not to give Canada too much credit, we do have a safe supply program, but it probably reaches 5% of the people who need to be, and I don't know what that's, well, of course it's politics, but just for the record, we always say that we do all these brilliant, wonderful things, and yet we half-heartedly do them. Over to you, Ethan. I do want to ask you actually, how did fentanyl come about? Why is it in everything these days? What is it, a deliberate thing? Is it a response to prohibition with its, it's a big bang for your buck, as you were saying earlier, it's a small amount, can go a long way, easier to import?
I mean, Jillian, there is this kind of, sort of iron rule of prohibition that when you crack down on drugs sort of indiscriminately, the people who make money from transporting them and selling them tend to prefer the drugs that are more compact and can be more easily hidden. Consumers sometimes prefer the drugs that could be more discreetly consumed. So, for example, in the part of the 20th century, when there was a crackdown on opium, coming into the U.S. and in the U.S., I mean, that helped accelerate a shift towards heroin because it was far more compact than opium. It was also easier, more discreet to consume. There's a famous article in the field about 50 years ago by a professor named Joseph Westermeyer in the Archives of General Psychiatry. It was called The Pro-Heroin Effects of Anti-Opium Laws. And he showed that back in the first third or before World War II, many countries in Southeast Asia and a few in Southwest Asia had these opium control systems, basically like modern day methadone programs in a way, where mostly older people and sometimes others, were allowed to obtain through legal channels a certain amount of opium. And it had become a manageable problem, not a big deal. Then under pressure from the League of Nations, the United States government, what you saw was the elimination of these programs throughout Asia. And the result at first was a significant reduction in the number of elderly people consuming opium. Everybody applauded that. And then fairly shortly thereafter, the rapid spread of heroin being consumed far more by young people with much more dangerous consequences, not part of a traditional there was a traditional opium using culture, but not one of a traditional heroin using culture, and involving smoking and injecting of it and helping to launch the spread of HIV/AIDS, right? So people shifting in that way. There was another set of well-known articles by an academic called Ansley Hamid, called From Ganja to Crack in the International Journal of the Addictions back in the, I think, late 80s, early 90s. And he showed how when Vice President Bush in the early 80s led a Caribbean task force crackdown on drugs coming from Jamaica and Colombia, what people did was they shifted from smuggling ganja, cannabis, marijuana to the US to smuggling cocaine. And that was far more destructive to everybody involved in that process. So I think you see something similar with fentanyl. And in fact, it raises an interesting thought experiment here. If we look what happened in the United States, beginning at the end of the 90s and the early aughts, you had the Purdue Pharma and the other major pharmaceutical companies promoting and selling and pushing, their oxycodones. Purdue Pharma's was called OxyContin. Other ones had other generic versions of it, which were a very effective medication for dealing with acute pain and which were helpful for some people dealing with chronic pain, but which they grossly over-promoted for all types of chronic pain. And that was part of what accelerated the overdose, crisis of more people dying. Not so much the patients, that happened to some patients who became iatrogenically addicted by their doctors, but far more by these drugs getting into the broader illicit system, being diverted. We began to crack down on that around 15 years ago. And then you saw a shift to Mexican heroin. I mean, Mexico has produced between 30 and 80% of all the heroin consumed in the United States for the last century. And there's basically no way to stop it effectively, right? And that was a problem, but these drugs turned out to be somewhat more problematic than the pharmaceuticals, because at least for the pharmaceuticals, sometimes the consumer knew what they were getting. But with the heroin, you were dealing with adulterated supply. Although, as Deborah kind of pointed out, most of those heroin overdose fatalities in the past were not about people overdosing from taking too much heroin. They typically involved taking heroin in combination with booze or heroin in combination with tranquilizing drugs, benzodiazepine. It was a toxic drug combination that was killing people. And then you have the emergence of fentanyl 6-7 years ago. It had popped up maybe 20 years ago when some lab in Mexico started producing it. And that lab had been shut down and fentanyl had been cut off. And everybody, that was one of the few examples of a drug war enforcement operation actually proving successful. But it was a short-lived success. And so then when fentanyl and the precursors start getting produced in China and shipped through Mexico and Canada to the US and into Canada. And then eventually the Mexicans begin to take over the entire business from the Chinese. And maybe the Chinese are still producing the precursors, but the Mexicans are, and there's no limit. And the amount of fentanyl that can result in getting you high or killing you is, 1/50th to 100th the actual physical amount. And so you have the problem of an unregulated drug supply. The fatal problem, the most fatal aspect of drug prohibition is an unregulated drug supply. Now, when it's unregulated marijuana, there's a little bit of concern. When it's unregulated cocaine, a little bit of a concern. Unregulated heroin, a bigger concern. When you're talking about unregulated fentanyl, you're talking about taking a drug which you don't have to combine with other drugs in order to die of an overdose or a toxic drug combination, right? It can just kill you all by itself. And the thought experiment that I want to throw to your listeners is imagine, right? And I'm not proposing this as a policy, but it's just a thought experiment to kind of think this through more deeply. Imagine if we had never really cracked down on those pharmaceutical companies taking advantage of promoting these OxyContins and these pharmaceuticals. Imagine if we still were living today with a very leaky pharmaceutical drug opioid system. It's possible that if that were still the system by which people who wanted to use opioids illegally were able to get them, it's quite possible that there might never have been the opening for fentanyl to emerge in the way that it did. Now that it's emerged, 6, 7 years ago, when people who were accustomed to heroin got fentanyl, they were going like, what the hell is this? We'd rather get heroin. And dealers were beginning to cut the heroin with fentanyl because they can make more money with it. Now you have a whole new generation of consumers who, when they get heroin, they go, what the hell is this? We want our fentanyl. So consumers are actually looking for fentanyl now. But one of the great mysteries is why is so much of the cocaine and methamphetamine supply being cut with fentanyl? You can see if people are looking for opioids, they want that. And nobody's got a good answer to that. They don't know where the stimulant drugs, cocaine and methamphetamine, are being cut with the fentanyl. Is it just at the retail level or higher up the chain? Is it being done knowingly by people involved in the distribution or unknowingly? Is it accidental tainting? Is it because a growing number of consumers want a kind of modern day speedball? The speedball used to be heroin and cocaine combined, and now it's fentanyl and cocaine or methamphetamine put together. But when you see that 20 or 30% in many parts of the US of all of the overdose fatalities involve, people who thought they were using cocaine or had cocaine, were taking cocaine, but with fentanyl, that's a fatal result. And I think, what's the answer? One question is, why is this problem so uniquely American and sort of Canadian, and maybe you see it going on in parts of the United Kingdom, and like Estonia, I think, has got a bad problem. But we've not seen these massive overdoses throughout much of the rest of the world. And so one question is there something special about the US or the US and Canada that makes this the case? It's hard to understand why fentanyl could not just as easily be landing up in Europe or other parts of the world. I think clearly when it comes to solution, you guys in Vancouver and British Columbia are pioneering, are paving the way with a safe supply approach. But as you pointed out, it's only reaching a very small percentage of the people who might benefit for it. To put a punchline on this, it really comes down to one of the big sort of $64,000 questions of drug policy and drug legalization, which is, on the one hand, for those people who are determined to get their drugs, and if they cannot obtain them from a legal source, they're going to go to an illicit source with all the problems of criminality and adulterated drug supply. Well, you want to do, as the government, whatever is possible to allow those people to obtain their drug from a legal supply rather than an illegal supply. It just makes sense until those people are ready to stop using and reducing their use. On the other hand, you want to make sure you're doing that in a way that does not flood these drugs out into the much broader community and create, bigger problems. And how to achieve that balance of allowing people who are committed to getting their drugs, they're going to get it from the black market if they can't get it from the legal market. How do you allow them to get it legally without presenting a broader threat to the broader society? And I think, I'm grateful for you guys in Canada for kind of trying to work this way through, because hopefully it can become a model for the US and any other countries that eventually get hit with the fentanyl problem.
Thank you. Anything to add to that, Deborah? Those are good questions.
So, the thing for me is that I feel like part of the problem in our part of the world is that we approach these things from the wrong space. We're still looking at reducing people's access to drugs as opposed to looking at the demand. I mean, we claim to be a free market economy, capitalist economy, and yet we think the laws of capitalism are not supposed to apply to these substances, when of course they do, as everything else does. And so as long as there is a high demand, like I don't see us engaged in the conversation why it is that the high income countries with the highest level of inequality also have highest levels of drug consumption. It's not an accident that the US, the UK, and Canada consume way more drugs than most of the Western European countries. And I think it's related to our socioeconomic setup, the level of inequality that we have, the level of disaffection, the lack of a social safety net. And that's not to say that everybody who uses drugs are people who have fallen between the cracks. What I'm saying is that we have a society in its overall construction that is not designed to maximize people's happiness, regardless of where you fall within the socioeconomic spectrum. And because we don't deal with that, we have all these other avenues and ways for people to escape the reality of the miserable lives that we're living. But we don't talk about why is it that we're willing to accept the status quo in which people are not happy, and they're finding all kinds of different ways to escape their unhappiness. And I say we should look at the countries which have a much higher happiness index and also have much lower levels of drug abuse and addiction to look for some of the answers, as opposed to having it be about the drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, Julie, I remember going to the Netherlands, years ago and asking the Dutch, how come you're successful? How come you have so few people dying of drugs? How come the average age of your heroin addicts is now in the 40s? How come blah, 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 blah? And they said, you think, well, our drug policy obviously helps. We have a harm reduction drug policy. We're pragmatic. But the truth is we have, as Deborah's saying, we have a social welfare safety net, unlike you guys. We have had national health insurance for a very long time. We have housing policies. We have people that catch people when they're falling. And in the US, you have some of those systems in the cities. You have them in some other places, but we don't have them in a big, broad way. I mean, although on the other hand, I also have to say, it's interesting that cities like San Francisco and Vancouver, which are so relatively progressive relative to the rest of the countries, Canada and the US, it's interesting that even the cities with very progressive policies are having such terrible problems with this. And I don't really know what the answer is.
We're not that progressive.
Well, I'm just saying, compared to the rest of the country, though, I mean, Vancouver stands out and San Francisco really does stand out. And part of this also is, I don't know, but it's also true. These are beautiful cities, and you have more homeless people in these cities than you do in some redder parts of America and things like this. But why? It's something we as progressives have to deal with, which is why are these problems, particularly bad? They're not just being bad in conservative and right-wing or reactionary places. They're also bad in cities that are oftentimes have relatively progressive leadership.
But progressive leadership has nothing to do with income inequality. And as a person who lives in the Bay Area, one of the reasons we have such a high level of homelessness is because of the lack of affordability. America is a space of extremes, and we've become okay with having extreme wealth right next to extreme poverty. We have people sleeping on the streets next to some of the most expensive real estate in the country. And somehow that's okay. And that to me is not progressive. Just because
Deborah,
you vote,
I know.
I don't.
On the other hand, I wonder, because you have other cities around America that have, more conservative places, and they don't have as big a problem as some of the progressive cities. So it's one of the things I try to figure. I agree with your basic analysis.
To us.
I think that's part of it. The fact is more progressive cities have actually, there's lots of more homeless for the reasons you're describing about, the incredible disparities in wealth and the lack of affordable housing. Or other places for people to live. But it's also true that the policies are generally more welcoming or friendly towards people who are homeless, whereas in other parts of the country, which are highly punitive and where the cops just keep locking people up. Which is, of course, with more and more people are beginning to propose in places like San Francisco, which in the end is going to be a highly cost ineffective and inhumane approach. But it is truly a dilemma.
Only if you're wedded to maintaining predatory capitalism as your system of economic organization and refuse to discuss any other avenues of wealth redistribution. Again, when I look around the world, and particularly at our Western European neighbors, there is a different ethic, around wealth disparities that doesn't allow for the head of a corporation to make 1,000 times more than the lowest worker. We have no problem with that. And so as long as we're willing to tolerate these huge levels of disparities, and wealth disparity, it's not just a disparity in money, it's a disparity in access to basic needs, food, housing, shelter, healthcare, etc. We don't even make sure that people's basic needs are met. And I'll just make the point, because I'm sitting here today, at a time when I'm watching where 1/3 of our country has now stripped women of the right to have control over their reproductive capacity, where they will be forced to bear babies, whether they want them or not. The same third of the country that has been racing to strip women's reproductive rights away does not provide income for those families that even meets half of the federal poverty level, which in the US in 2022 is $27,000 for a family of 4. Not a single one of those states, of the 12 states that have banned abortion, provides assistance to a family that's even half of that level. And I think that says a lot about who we are as a country and how much we value life, and just how hypocritical we are, that we would think it was okay to force women to come into to have children in those circumstances.
It's hard to be optimistic these days about any of that, right?
It
I mean, you
certainly
look at the electorate, and
is.
especially in America more than Canada, but you have some of this in Canada. We're heading, it seems like, thank God the election results were not as bleak as we feared, but there's an enormous amount of disconnection from what government policy should be that might lead to a better society. And, it's hard to see where that's going to be turning around. Yeah.
Are you
anyway,
too
I don't want to get too depressed.
No, that's not good, too depressed, because we're going to talk about psychedelics soon. But I just wanted to bring up Gabor Mate's latest book. So a Vancouver-based author, world-renowned these days. And the book is called The Myth of Normal. And actually, he'll be joining us for an interview at some point early next year in 2023. And are you guys familiar with it? Have you read it or read about it?
The truth is, Julian, I'm going to have Gabor, I'm going to interview him for my podcast in a few weeks. So I will be reading his book in the next week or two.
Right.
But I've just taken a quick look at it, so I don't know deeply what it's about.
It is, though.
I haven't read this new one, but I love his writing. And, I think the work that he's been doing is so important for getting people to think differently about drugs and addiction. And just two things I wanted to say, since we're on this topic about reproductive health, which is that many of the states that are outlawing abortion are also moving to make it impossible for women to access the drugs that they can use for medication abortions. And why that's important, it's because when Roe was first put out by the court in 1973, that was before the war on drugs, before Nixon had, or right at the beginning of the time that Nixon had declared the war on drugs. And so we didn't have the huge array of laws and tools and practices that have been developed over the last 40 years as part of the US-based war on drugs. Now, those same tools that have been developed to fight against these quote unquote illicit drugs can now be used against women who try to access misoprostol and mifepristone to use for chemical medical abortions. And so it's another expansion of against people's individual rights. It's another expansion of the police powers of the states under the guise of public safety, in this case, protecting fetuses from the predations of the women who are carrying them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, if it worked so far and so well, the war on drugs, not for getting people to stop using drugs, but to pick on them and incarcerate them and do whatever else. Of course, that's going to work in this case too, and it's a sad state of affairs. Moving right along, as we should, because we're the Psychedelic Association of Canada, and we also want to talk about. We have been already talking about the prohibition and the war on drugs, and now I want to move a little bit into what you feel. I want to actually talk about psychedelics and prohibition, but first of all, what has changed since both of you started in this world of prohibition and the war on drugs? Have there been improvements? Let's start there.
Go ahead, Ethan.
Okay.
No, you go ahead.
I mean, look, I think to focus at first on the positive side of things. Julia, I was just at a meeting and people were asked to line up about how long they've been involved in drug policy reform. And I was like at the far end, 36 years since I first started speaking out about this issue, just as the war on drugs was really picking up speed. And I'd say overall, there's been quite substantial progress in the US and quite a number of other places. I mean, if you go back to 1986, almost everybody across the political spectrum was in favor of the war on drugs. I mean, it was really almost a national consensus in a way like anti-communism had been in an early era, and only just the variations were in how fanatical you were going to be about it. And there was a small dissident group. Marijuana was criminalized everywhere, the whole thing. And I'll tell you, you fast forward to right now. I mean, I even think going back to 1994, when I started the London Smith Center, which eventually became Drug Policy Alliance, at that point, 0 states had legalized marijuana for anything. And, barely 30% of Americans thought that marijuana should be legalized. And we were just breaking 55% who thought it should be legal for medical. Now, 90% of Americans believe marijuana should be legal for medicine. 65% believe it should be illegal for all adults. As of election day, we now have 21 states that have legalized marijuana for all adults, and almost 40 that have legalized medical marijuana. So it's been a sea change that the only thing comparable to it has been regarding gay rights, LGBTQ rights in America. I mean, those have been the two great sort of social transformations that have happened, and where a kind of progressive mindset has won out. And of course, with Canada legalizing and Uruguay legalizing, and now you're going to see it happen in Europe, and now Thailand just did it. It looks like Colombia could do it, in the next couple of years. It looks like Mexico keeps, stumbling their way towards legalization. So, I mean, it's been a monumental shift. And at this point also, you see, even you're getting a close to 50% or more of Republicans supporting it, a substantial majority of young Republicans supporting it, even red states supporting it and voting to legalize medical marijuana, in some cases even, Missouri just legalizing marijuana. So that's been a radical transformation. Then, secondly, if you look at the Trump administration, there was almost no bipartisanship going on back then in those 4 years. But two of the biggest bills to get through Congress with bipartisan support, one was a bill to roll back some of the mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, and the other one was a bill to deal with the opioid crisis in a way which, wasn't as big and ambitious as it would have been if the Democrats had driven it, but it was still a significant step forward in terms of funding and thinking. And both of those things were unimaginable just, 10 years ago, 15 years earlier than that. So we saw an emerging recognition that in America, a majority believe that too many people are behind bars, that we need to have more of a public health approach regarding opioids and all of that. And then finally, you get to the psychedelic renaissance. I mean, once again, that's extraordinary. Nobody anticipated this exploding the way it has. And, that's due to the amazing work of Rick Doblin and his organization MAPS, and working on MDMA and getting it through the FDA process and the broader education of the public around psychedelics. And also a fellow like Michael Pollan, who had a following of millions because of his brilliant writing about food, and then crosses over to write that book, How to Change Your Mind, about psychedelics, that really, one of those rare crossover books that really moves people in a big way. And so now you see this, psychedelic renaissance with major universities in North America and England and Europe, setting up psychedelic research centers where you see, and also not just liberals and progressives, you see former, Texas governor, Republican Rick Perry, who was Trump's Secretary of the Interior, playing a key role in Texas, passing a law to allow, research on psychedelics, driven by wanting to help veterans. So I think those things, some of which were inconceivable just 10 or 20 years ago, suggest that we've had a remarkable progress. And I sometimes ask myself, I sometimes wonder, were there some things that we did right that might provide lessons for dealing with a broader crisis in US politics and the profound polarization that's going on now? Now, that said, of course, that said, there's still a massive way to go. We still lead the world in incarceration and incarceration rates. We still have even liberal politicians, as Deborah was saying before, feeling compelled, to oppose certain, cutting-edge harm reduction measures or to support tougher penalties on fentanyl, even though they know it's not going to make any difference for the same reason it didn't make any difference before. We still have the stigmatization and the criminalization. And then in an area I've become particularly engaged in recent years, I see us beginning to have a creeping prohibitionist policy regarding tobacco and an anti-harm reduction policy regarding nicotine that really is just mimicking the same stupidities that that we had with the war on drugs in days past. So it's not as if we're ever ultimately going to learn. I just say that having worked in this for so long, and obviously I have a personal emotional stake in pointing out some of the good stuff, but I do think that objectively speaking, and also I hear in terms of what I hear from all sorts of people wherever I travel, we really have made quite substantial strides, even though there is a massive way still to go.
Okay, thank you. Deborah?
Oh, God. So I actually agree with Ethan about a lot of what he said, but I come at it a slightly different way in that I think America has become less hypocritical about drugs. And I say it that way because I've been a cannabis consumer my entire adult life, which is more than 50 plus years. And there's never been a time where it was hard to get. And most of the people who I was able to get it from were white professionals. And so, and the best drugs I ever had was when I was working as a lawyer in a firm on Wall Street. People literally brought them to us. And I say that to say that the drug culture in America is a long history. We're a country who has always had a strong relationship with intoxicating substances. What's changed to me is our willingness to own that, to deal with it in other than just punitive ways, and I give Ethan a lot of credit for that, because I think what I see has shifted has been the willingness of people who are educated and respectable and have considered to have status and influence, being willing to talk honestly and openly about things that have been going on all along. It's kind of like the conversation about LGBTQ people. It's not like they just got discovered in the 70s. They were always here. We've always had a significant population of people among us who were queer, who were different. The difference was our unwillingness to acknowledge them, to recognize them, to give them the same level of rights that everybody else had. So I feel like that's one of the things that has shifted with respect to drugs, is that was a category in which, as a society, we felt it was okay to discriminate against people based on their drug use, in the same way we thought it was okay to discriminate against gay people or Black people or immigrants or whatever. I think that that's a shift, in that people don't necessarily feel that the fact that a person uses drugs is enough of a justification to exclude them from society, from their ability to have a job and have housing, etc. That's a shift. Now, it isn't an equal shift, because we seem to have a different attitude for people who sell drugs versus we do for people who just use drugs. And I see that as one of the areas where we could learn as a movement. Like, I think that the public conversation around drugs in the US has in many ways been influenced by the work of drug policy advocates over the last 25 years. And it reflects the messages that we've been putting out into the public. And a lot of that has been about having more sympathy for people who are using drugs, to prefer giving them access to treatment as opposed to locking them up. And that's become basically the majority of the public agrees with that. But we haven't necessarily been as vocal in advocating on behalf of people who sell drugs, you know, on behalf of the people for whom the drug economy is their survival economy. And I think, to me, that's sort of the next frontier for the drug policy movement, is to be willing to address that aspect of it, because it is all part of an economy. And part of the problem I see with the legalization around cannabis is that there hasn't been enough attention paid to the people who are being displaced in that drug economy through legalization. So I'm here in California. I would like to think that one of the results of legalization is that cannabis would be cheaper, but it's not. It's actually more expensive than it was before. And it's actually worse than it was when we had medical marijuana, because many of the small growers have been pushed out. And now it's an agribusiness, just like the other agribusinesses that we have in California. So I think that there are lessons for us to learn about the ways to move drug policy and to move away from prohibition into a regulatory system that's more equitable. And so to me, that means taking into account the role of capitalism as it plays in your business model. One of the reasons that there's more bipartisan support for cannabis legalization is because people see it as a business opportunity, and state governments see it as a revenue for taxes. And part of the reason cannabis is so expensive in California is that they add 40% tax on it. I can't think of anything other than sex that you can get away with adding 40% tax on, and people would still pay for it. But they think that they can do that because of its previous status as being illegal, which, you know, is counterproductive in so many ways. That's a whole nother conversation. But I say all that to say that I think the next frontier for the drug policy movement is to really think about regulatory frames that are that can work, that take into account the role of capitalism, that take into account the people who are displaced when you bring it into the regular economy, and who and to that harm reduction isn't just about, you know, not locking people up. It's also about correcting and repairing the harms that have been done to communities as a result of decades of punitive and discriminatory drug policies. And in Canada, that would be directly to First Nations people who are still disproportionately impacted by your policies. And in the US, it's African American, Indigenous, and Latino people.
I remember talking to a former Attorney General of BC like 10 years ago, or 15 probably, and saying not everything you said, Deborah, because I couldn't possibly be that articulate, but I was complaining about the way it was going to roll out. And he said, well, you have to wait a little bit of time, but if you think about beer and alcohol in British Columbia, there, you know, people drink Budweiser, and then they also have available to them like the boutique sort of beer places, whatever they're called. I don't drink it, so I don't really know. And then there's room for all. Is that, what do you think about that?
Go ahead, Ethan.
Yeah, what I was going to say is, I mean, I think I agree with a fair bit of what Deborah said. I mean, I do think obviously the other major frontier on this thing is what's happening with the decriminalization of possession of all drugs. You know, the Oregon ballot initiative, you know, 2 years ago, Oregon passed two initiatives. One was to basically legalize psychedelic possession, and then the second was to set up a kind of, not quite medical, but a therapeutic model for people to be able to access some of these substances. And then Colorado, just on election day, became the second state to do a different variant of that Oregon model. But the other Oregon bill was about all drug decrim. Basically, the model in the US. And that's something I'm very proud that my successors, the Drug Policy Alliance, led that effort, and we're successful. And hopefully that's going to become a successful model. We're going to see similar initiatives on the ballot, I'm hoping, in a couple of years, in California or Washington, or maybe in the East, or maybe Colorado. We'll have to see. So that's a major frontier. I think the issue that Deborah raises about the people who've been involved in production and sale is really valid. And there is no clear and easy answer on that thing. I mean, I'm proud of the fact that in California, we made some efforts in drafting the legalization, because DPA led the drafting of that California initiative, not all aspects of it because we were in a partnership, but significant aspects. And, we put in there for the first time that a significant portion of tax revenues should go to help those communities that have been most harmed by the drug war. So there were steps taken in that direction. I think in other states, what you see are more and more efforts to promote, racial and social equity, both for, Black and brown communities and indigenous communities that were most harmed, as well as, for, white people who have been engaged, multi-generation marijuana growing families who can't compete in a fully legal regulated market. So I think those things, that there's a moral obligation to try to do the best you can and all that. But I'll also say, Jillian, in responding directly to what you were saying before, that, I've been at meetings where I find myself feeling somewhat optimistic that there are examples happening. I mean, New York is now a model, at least on paper, of legalizing marijuana in a way which has a heavy equity element to it that should hopefully help a lot of people who were harmed by the war on drugs, who came from those communities. I think Washington, D.C., it doesn't have a specific equity approach, but in fact, the percentage of businesses that are Black owned in D.C., it's not equal to the percentage of the population that's Black, but it is substantial and has the potential to become equal to that. I'm struck by the fact that you take a state like Oklahoma, which legalized medical marijuana and is incredibly unregulated. It's the least regulated state in the country. All the growers in California who are frustrated by how overregulated and overtaxed California is, you have many of them move in Oklahoma. And the interesting thing is, in Oklahoma, people tell me that if you go to a Black neighborhood in Oklahoma, odds are it's going to be a Black person who owns the local marijuana shop there. Right? And it's just because the regulations and the taxes are so low that it's very easy entry. Now, that said, we do live in perhaps the most dynamic capitalist society in history, with all the goods and all the evils that involves. And that means that I think, it's probably somewhat inevitable that down the road, most of this industry, as with alcohol and tobacco and coffee and most other commodities, is going to be dominated by large corporations. Right now we point our fingers at the multi-state operators who have 50 or 100 outlets around the states or country. But, I interviewed on my podcast, Psychoactive, I interviewed Boris Jordan, who's head of Curaleaf, the biggest marijuana multi-state operator in the world. And he said 10 years from now, he predicts that big tobacco is going to be big marijuana, right? So I think that some of this stuff may be unstoppable. In fact, one reason I hesitate about supporting full federal, abolition of prohibition of cannabis, the total descheduling of marijuana, which for a long time was mine and DPA's and others' objective, is because once you do that, it removes any barriers to big tobacco, big alcohol, or big consumer goods getting involved. It removes the barriers to importing marijuana from other countries that can produce it at lower cost than we can in the U.S. It removes the ability to have the kind of protectionist policies that many states have set up to protect their local growers, because once it's federally legal, the Interstate Commerce Clause will make those sort of state protectionist measures, no longer constitutional. Now, as that fellow said to you, that attorney general said to you, you think about what happened after alcohol, before alcohol prohibition. I think there were large numbers of dispensaries, of distilleries and breweries and many brands. By the time you get to the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it's a very small number of companies that are dominating everything. You have real homogenization of the product, right? Now you travel around America and you see microbreweries all over the place. I was in Grand Rapids, Michigan, a somewhat depressed city, and one brewery after another. You see micro distilleries popping up all over the place. Mm-hmm. And they're becoming 1% and 2% and 5% and 7% or more of the market. And the ones that get bigger ultimately probably sell themselves to the big guys, right? But they're at least little guys getting bigger and making a lot of money. And then I think about coffee. When I moved back to New York City 30 years ago, there were a whole great variety of coffee shops. Fast forward 10 years, and basically Starbucks has come in, and you see almost no coffee shops still surviving. It's Starbucks everywhere, like, on every corner. Now you walk around New York City and you see more independent and, or maybe with 2 or 3 branches of coffee shops than ever before, far more than there were 30 years ago. Right. And so what you find are the little guys finding their niche, but only after the people originally there got wiped out in all of this stuff. So there is a dynamic in capitalism which can be shaped somewhat by government policy. But I also, I'm ultimately pessimistic about how big and consequential it can be. For me, what's most important, right, and I think this is particularly important for younger listeners, for me, the reason I got involved in this stuff was I hated the fact that millions of people were getting arrested and going to prison for marijuana and other drugs. I hated the fact that millions of people were losing their jobs or being kicked out of school or having their kids taken away from them or having their cars and their property taken away from them because they were involved in cannabis or other illicit drug markets. So the fact that we're moving into a world where, hundreds of thousands of people are no longer getting busted or penalized or fired or harmed by the war on drugs and prohibition is monumental. The fact that my hope to be grandchildren will be able to grow up and say, you mean, Grandpa, people used to get arrested for this stuff? You mean you used to have to buy this from, the illicit market? I mean, that's the major victory. Now, how this market sorts itself out and whether the things we do in good faith now to help protect those people who were harmed by the war on drugs or who were benefiting from the illegality and can only compete, I say we got to try our best. But I don't hold out, I think, false expectations that it can have a monumental impact about what comes next. And I think the fact that we're producing, by legalizing marijuana, literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of jobs that are going to be, accessible to all sorts of people at all sorts of elements of the industry, I think is a very, very positive thing. I think that in many states, a significant portion of the tax revenue is specifically being dedicated for social justice purposes, and people are owning up. I mean, when I travel around the country still speaking on this stuff, I say, look, no other industry, comes out of these origins. No other industry used to be entirely illegal with millions of people being arrested and punished and is now becoming illegal. And that creates a special obligation for people who are in this industry today. So I can say that stuff. And I think it shapes some people, and government policies can shape things a bit in the right direction. But I don't think we can be naive that in a society as dynamic and as capitalist as America, and I don't see that changing anytime soon, unless we become a truly fascist society, in which case we have a form of corporatist capitalism. I think we're making great strides and do what we can. But like that Attorney General said to you, some of this stuff will shake out in a positive way. A lot of it, not in some of the ways we hope.
Yeah, and thank you. How does the rise of psychedelics and plant medicines in the space impact prohibition?
So I think it's a good thing. I'll just say very quickly 2 things, Ethan. I'll go back.
Please go ahead.
Let her go back to you too. So a couple of things. One, my concern, and I see psychedelics as the next frontier of drugs that will open up. But I have to tell you, I am concerned about what I see happening in the cannabis market. One of the results that we don't talk a lot about legalization has been the proliferation of products that it has generated. And I'm worried about backlash that I see happening when parents, are concerned that their kids have access to what for marijuana in terms of potency at the equivalent of toxicity of smoking, of small amounts of crack. I mean, the truth is that kids can get access, and when I say kids, I mean people in their teens can get access to cannabis products that are 80-90% concentrated THC. That's not something that comes from the whole plant. That's not something that was available when we were first advocating for legalizing cannabis. And one of the problems of doing it in a relatively unregulated capitalist market is that people are going to do the thing that they think is the most profitable, regardless of the health effects. And I'll give 2 examples. when we were advocating for legalizing in California, one of the things we promised people was that there weren't going to be billboards advertising cannabis all over the place. Well, there are literally billboards all over California, all over highways, et cetera, advertising cannabis products, cannabis dispensaries, et cetera. Why? Because the industry now has enough money and enough clout that they can lobby to get the rules changed to allow them to do things that we promised parents they wouldn't do. I personally think that overall, people should be able to have access, in a free market to the products that they want. But the truth of the matter is that when you're talking about drugs, anything that's potentially addictive, and I'm not just talking about the things that are illicit, I'm also talking about legal drugs, sugars, et cetera. I, as a parent, try very hard to moderate what goes into my child's mouth and what they have access to, because there are a lot of things out there that are unhealthy. I really worry that we've set ourselves up to have a backlash against marijuana legalization because it's not being regulated in a way that actually provides maximum safety for people. And I know that that's not a very popular thing to say, but I worry about that because I see way too many people engaged in what I would consider to be an abusive relationship with that. I worry about that happening with psychedelics if they're available to people, because in order for them to be used, they have to be used wisely. They have to be used safely. Otherwise, they can be harmful to people. And so my problem is that, capitalism doesn't care about harms to people. They just care about profit. And so the failure to actually build that in, I think, can generate a backlash that'll undermine all the progress that we've made. I'll stop with that. Go ahead, Ethan.
I would just say on that, I think, look, some of this thing I think is just simply inevitable. Some of this is not about legalization, because a lot of these concentrates and, the dabbing and all these kind of hyperpotency things, those emerged in the illicit market. Right. And we have to remember that, there's legal capitalism and there's illegal capitalism. When you live in a socialist dictatorship like the Soviet Union was, you had massive underground capitalism. Right. I mean, it's people, wanting to buy and trade and make their own profit and live outside the government sanctioned economic system. So one way or another, and the creativity that goes into that, it's capitalism, legal regulation, legalization makes that stuff more readily available to adults and it filters out there. But all of those products, or most of those products, were emerging in a prohibitionist frame, and they just now happen to be, being available in the legal frame. I think the second thing is that one of them, I was just at this meeting with people talking about the equity stuff, and there were, basically a number of mostly Black women who owned dispensaries and were small business people. And I'd never been at a meeting of progressives where there was so much talk about overtaxation and overregulation. Now, the fact is, if it's important as it's been, and look, we played a big role, Drug Policy Alliance, in drafting these things. You're trying to offer public health protections. You're trying to offer protection on the quality of the product, environmental protections, but all of those things cost money and involve more regulation. All of those things make it tougher for sort of people who don't have access to capital, for poorer people, white, Black, and brown, to be able to break into the market. So there's built-in contradictions among the multiple objectives we want to achieve with a full legal regulation market. So I think one can compensate for some of that by dedicating government funding for training programs, or to provide, as some places are now doing, providing capital for low-income, business people so that they can break into the market. So we can do some of that. But I think that the fact of, this stuff getting out, I agree that it's not a good thing. I agree with you, there's going to be a backlash. I think that's inevitable. But I think, even if we're doing everything right, there would still be backlashes. I think that some of this stuff is just part of the process of going through this sort of monumental transition we're going through, almost a century of, this plant being criminalized, to one in which it's being legalized and legally regulated. Now, what I would say, Julian, on the psychedelics thing is, I think this is overwhelmingly a positive thing, right? I mean, part of what I do is, in my kind of retirement life, is when I'm going out and speaking to groups, I'm basically, on the one hand, speaking to my colleagues who are on the base in drug policy reform movement, drug policy alliance, and saying, play ball in this psychedelics area. Don't ignore it. Just because it doesn't have a big racial justice frame at this point, there's no reason to ignore the importance and the significance of what's going on. Psychedelics were criminalized. People did get punished. It wasn't the same levels of arrest and incarceration, but it shares with all the other substances, with cannabis, heroin, cocaine, and everything else, the fact that it was criminalized as part of the war on drugs. It was demonized. It was stigmatized. And a lot of people got harmed as a result of that. But then I'm also going to the psychedelics gatherings, where there's a lot of talk about psychedelic exceptionalism. And the way I address that in talking to psychedelics gatherings is I start off by saying, listen, everybody's criticizing psychedelic exceptionalism. Well, let me tell you something. I am a psychedelic exceptionalist. I am a marijuana and psychedelic exceptionalist in my own personal life, because those are the drugs that have played a very significant positive role in my life with very little downside. And that's not nearly as true of the range of other substances. And I think more broadly in our society, that's also true, that the benefit cost ratio of cannabis and psychedelics in most societies is enormous. And the same cannot be said of cocaine or heroin or a range of other things that are part of the illicit market. That said, the core principle that nobody deserves to be punished for what we put in our bodies if we don't hurt anybody else. That core principle that I think undergirds a huge part of drug policy reform and harm reduction, that nobody deserves to be punished or discriminated against or monks based solely upon what substance we choose to put in our body, has to apply across all substances in the same way that the First Amendment applies across all types of speech, both elevated and despicable speech, just short of yelling fire in a crowded theater, or the same thing with religion or press, right? We need these principles to apply more broadly. And that means that the principle that nobody should be punished or go to jail or lose their freedom because of the substance they put in their body has to apply across all substances. And the principle that we need to move as much as possible in the direction of a sensible, pragmatic, decent, legal regulatory system and away from prohibition has to apply as well. And I'm sort of always putting that in the face of the people involved in the psychedelics area. Now, I think this psychedelic renaissance is amazing. And I think it's amazing to see the decrim initiatives that started getting passed initially in Denver some years ago, and then in Oakland, and now in a host of other cities. The legalization initiatives, you see all that Oregon and just now Colorado passed. I think these things are enormous steps forward that just 5-10 years ago were totally almost unimaginable that the public would support measures like this. And I think the research is enormously exciting in terms of, the field of psychiatry could be revolutionized by what we're finding with some of the psychedelic medicines. The thing that confuses me, and that I don't particularly like, is I looked what happened in Colorado recently, where you had some of the folks who were focused on the plant and the legalization of the plant and their own use and transactions in the plant itself. And they are opposing a lot of the broader psychedelic research world. And I think that's a mistake, because to my mind, the advances in psychedelics research and psychedelics medicine in no way endangers, the common person's use of psychedelics or use of psilocybin or other things, indigenous people's uses of peyote and other substances like that. If anything, it reduces the stigma associated with those substances. It reduces the impulse to criminalize. And so I think it's really a win-win across the board when we're combining the decriminalization of personal production and use of the plant medicines with the advances in the psychedelic research. It's possible some of those companies can go too far and get greedy on patent stuff, but I think this stuff is mostly going to head in the right direction in this area.
Thank you. I think we know who those are, those companies that look to be going too far. And I just have to say, in Canada, the ones that I know most, we have a couple of large public companies who are trying to kind of bridge that out, going too far with capitalism and helping people and making, creating a business that's sustainable. So it's an interesting time to be watching them managing that. And what you just brought up, Ethan, really makes me move to another question that has been given to me by somebody else, and that is, how do we work together when we disagree how to do it? So there are a lot of different groups with different ideas, particularly around plant medicines and protecting them and appropriation and all of that sort of stuff, and protecting them so that we don't, we still have a supply, and how do we work with them? What would your
We'll sum it
advice
up
be?
sum it up with deep and empathic listening is the best place to start.
Deborah?
I just think it's like, these are plants. They come out of the earth. We don't own the earth.
Exactly.
And so for me, a lot of this dispute lies in people's desire to have ownership and control over things that were never meant to be interacted with in that way. And so, you know, I think one of the things that's exciting about, you know, working around these issues is that what we're talking about are plants. And so for me, it's like having people remember that these are plants that came from the ground, that they are plentiful, that there's no reason that we have to have this proprietary relationship to them. I guess that's my frustration. Is there a way for us to both free people's access to the plants and keep them free for people? And I don't mean like free, like no money, but you know what I'm saying? It's like there's always the problem comes in when people are trying to maintain a certain amount of proprietary ownership over things that really are meant for all of us. And so to the degree that we can keep that in mind as we move forward in coming up with regulatory systems for all of these drugs. I mean, I'm very mindful that the conversation that we have about coca in this country is very different than the ones that they have in Andean countries about the ability to use it as part of your everyday life, you know, in a safe and healthy way. And so I think our relationship to all of these substances is influenced by our cultural understanding and relationship to them. But the most important thing to me is for us to remember that these are plants that came from the ground. They don't belong to any of us. And part of what our work should be is to make them as freely available to people as possible. My concern, and this is a topic for another conversation, is that the future of drug markets is in synthetics. And that creates a whole nother set of problems, because all of the synthetic drugs are mimicking the properties of natural drugs. And it's inevitable that as science continues and chemistry continues to advance, that we will have synthetic drugs that mimic every drug that we're currently getting from a whole plant, including psychedelics. And then I don't know what we do about regulating and controlling that.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you, I mean, I think the nice thing, Deborah, in all of this, though, is that whether we're talking about cannabis or many of the psychedelics, the fact of the matter is it's pretty easy for many people to just grow their own marijuana or get it from a friend, right, who's growing it. In other words, the home grow element of this thing. And when it comes to psychedelics, there's nothing going on in the whole synthetics world that's going to keep people from getting a little kit and making their own psilocybin mushrooms at home, or getting a San Pedro plant and getting mescaline from that. So I think in that sense, that even as the companies move forward and try to isolate. I mean, look, remember, mescaline comes from the peyote and San Pedro plants. Psilocybin comes. Now you have companies trying to work out variants of the psilocybin molecule or the mescaline molecule or the ibogaine molecule in order to, create an experience that maybe is, gives you less of the downsides of the drugs, less of the nausea, maybe shorter acting. And I think that'll all be fine. And those companies will seek to patent it. And if they're lucky, they'll then get health insurance to pay for it. But the bottom line is, I think that this element of people opting out of the capitalist system, essentially, by being able to produce their home without fear of criminal sanction, I think that's not going to be stopped. And listen, I'll tell both of you guys right here, recently I was asked by one of the big marijuana companies whether I would join their board. And when I stepped down from Drug Policy Alliance 5 years ago, I was asked the same thing. And I said, guys, it's not unseemly. I've been involved in this forever as a nonprofit, public interest, fighting against the war on drugs. But it's now 5.5 years. And so I'm saying to this company, I think I'm willing to do it. But if you're going to ever be caught opposing the right of people to grow their own, I can't be associated with you. right? I'm intrigued to do it because it pays well. It'll be interesting. I'll learn a lot, and I may have a little bit of influence on them in terms of their doing a little more good and a little less bad, right? But I said, if it comes down to opposing home grow, which some of the big marijuana companies were doing at one point, that's a principle. That's a line in the dirt that cannot be crossed. And I think the same thing. If you see psychedelic companies opposing the right of people to possess their own and use their own, that'll be a line that's not acceptable. I was so upset. GW Pharmaceutical, the company in the UK that started working on medical marijuana in the late 1990s. And, I saw them as kind of allies, and they were the first ones to get FDA approval. They came up with Epidiolex and I think Sativex to, that had serious medical value, approved by the FDA. But then that same company hired this horrific deputy drug czar to oppose the broader medical marijuana movement. And so that's the line. When I see companies doing that I kind of get disgusted, and I will fight against them with everything I have.
We have 4 minutes left, and I just want to ask you in closing, what is the most important thing that occurs to both of you to move the bar? This is specifically for the psychedelic community and the psychedelic world, and how to talk to policymakers. Like, what's the thing top of mind for both of you?
I mean, I'll just say that I'm just so impressed by the role that veterans, military veterans, are playing in all of this, because they kind of, the dealing with their PTSD, dealing with the other traumas, some of them have been wounded and really harmed. There's such a kind of almost universal sympathy for them, and that psychedelic medicine should be available to them in the same way that when we got going with the medical marijuana movement. I mean, there was an early history in the 70s and 80s, and Bob Randall and others moving this forward. But when we really took it to another level, beginning with Prop 215 in California in 1996, it was always about putting the patients, the people who are going to directly benefit, out front, they or their parents or their loved ones. And I think the same thing with the psychedelics, when you put the human story out there, and especially the stories that pull on the heartstrings, the story of the veterans, which helps really cross over and engage the right wing of America, or when it comes to dealing, as we did with medical marijuana, about, the children who have that horrible epileptic condition, Dravet syndrome, where their parents become the most passionate advocates that nobody, no matter how anti-drug they are, will stand in the way of. I think those human stories, the ones that really cross over, it's pivotal to put that stuff out in front, and then of course back it up with the science and logic and reason and so on. Of
course. Deborah.
So personally, I would love for us to get to a point where we could look at the medicinal benefit of supporting people overcoming the harms that we did to them as a result of the war on drugs. Like the idea that there are drugs that can help overcome the harms of the drug war, that to me would be a great thing. Because the truth is, it's like there are so many traumatized people in our society. We need to recognize the trauma, not just in veterans. I'm a veteran of the drug war. I'm a veteran of the urban wars that are taking place in our cities every day, that have children have to do active shooter drills. There's a level of psychological harm that's occurring to people every day that we're not willing to acknowledge. My hope is that the science of psychedelics not only gives us more tools to help people, but also makes us more open to recognizing those harms. So it's not just for people who have obvious harm because they're missing a leg or they got shot in the head or whatever. I know so many people who are living with grief as a result of people that they lost to gun violence or COVID or HIV or whatever, where access to psychedelic therapeutics could do them a great deal of good. But we still don't have a public conversation about helping those people. It's only you have to be in extreme level of distress or harm before we think that you're deserving of getting access to something that'll help you. So my hope is that as a society, we can begin to shift our relationship with drugs away from seeing them as these scary things that are either good or bad, and seeing them more as tools that can be useful and think about what are the ways in which we can use them to benefit people as opposed to harming them.
And you know, when
Well
you put the details on that, it's some of that's going to become about the willingness of to have this covered by some forms of insurance, and the challenge is going to be if people are just insurance is probably never going to be available. Well, who knows? Who knows?
Maybe we can go to a space of national health insurance, so it's not about who's willing to pay for it. If we could ever get to the idea that healthcare was a basic human right, like housing and food.
I agree with you on that, Deborah.
Radical, you're radical, Deborah Small. I don't know. Yes, exactly. So Ethan Nadelmann, Deborah Small, you've no idea how much I love both of you and respect you. And I'm honored that you came on and spent an hour and a half with all the people in the psychedelic community. Thank you, everybody, for tuning into the Psychedelic Association of Canada's latest webinar. And I'm just delighted and can't say enough thanks. And good night for now.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's a lot of fun. It's great to see you, Ethan and Jillian.
You too, Deborah. You too, Jillian. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.